Welcome to Still Plays Galaxy of Heroes. This is my Grand Arena prep guide and recommendations. This is how I strategize for my Grand Arena matchups. I'm going to break it down how I do that. What I try to do is do this as quickly as possible. I don't like to spend too much time doing this. So this is the steps I take in preparation. There's a few things I do in game. There's a few things I do out of game. We're going to jump into, and I'm going to break down how I do those things in a little bit more detail. But overall is I look at the squads. I try to evaluate what the top squads are, if they have the right Zetas, if they have the gear on the right characters. I rank them. Then I look at the mods. I use the DSR bot that you can use in Discord, and that gives you just a very quick comparison to see where you match up with your opponent. Then I look at the Grand Arena history on SWGOH.gg, look to see if I can find any habits that I can see if my opponent has any weaknesses or trouble against certain comps. Then I plan my strategy strategy out from around that information. So we're going to jump into the game. Take a look at my Grand Arena opponent and matchup. Wanted to have this out a little bit earlier today, but I've had a little bit of troubleshooting with the computer and the record. So what I did there was, if you don't know about this, you just click on their name, you can go into their profile. Write down their ally code down here below. This is the only, whatever. If you access this information elsewhere, it's harder to find, but CG makes this easy to find when you access your opponent through Grand Arena. Go look at their stats. There's two stats that I look for that are just a quick shorthand on whether or not I need to do any additional work. I look at the lifetime championship score and the undersized wins. The lifetime championship score just tells me how seriously does my opponent take this game and how seriously they take this game mode. So in this case, my opponent has a championship score of 197k. That tells me they win more often than not. They probably go 3 for 3 usually, and only dropping 1 or 2 matchups per Grand Arena Championship. That's a little bit lower than mine, but it's very respectable. So undersized squad battles is the other one that I look at, because this tells me how well does my opponent know their roster, counters, and their makeup. This is a confidence metric. The more your opponent does undersized squads, the more they understand the nuances of this game and know which counters work against which teams. In this case, that's a low number. It's better than some, but it's way below mine. So I'm going to be expecting that if this came down to each of us full clearing in one shot, I'm going to come out a little bit ahead on banners because I usually go for any undersized wins that I can. Next thing is I hop into this inventory. What I do is I go through each faction and I give them a value between 1 and 6. And really it's just 3 and 6 and up that matter, because what I'm looking for is like a 6 is a fully relic squad or a meta squad that has most of the relics. 5 is just shorthand for saying, okay, you have all the relevant Zetas in your gear 12. Like this would be a 5 for a Shock T team, but not on a gas team. 4 is like a mix of gear 11 and gear 12 with the red Zetas, and 3 we're looking at a lot of gear 11 and below, and beyond that they're not usable teams, but I'm giving them a rating just to say, okay, how many usable squads does my opponent have? So I would jump through this and I look at, okay, which are my opponent's top squads, and then I want to make a list of what those are at. So if we take a look over here real quick, I have on a scratch piece of paper, just a second, a scratch piece of paper where I've listed out, okay, here are all their squads. Here's the rating that I'm giving them, and these are the top squads that I'm expecting my opponent to use on. In a worst case scenario, if my opponent were to use them, how I would need to prepare against them. So going through this really quickly, just showing you what I look for in each squad. Does Bosk have 1 or 2 Zetas? What is the gear level on Jenga? This is a decent bounty hunter team, but nothing to really worry about. JTR is going to be able to handle this, no problem. We already looked at the clones. Droids, I'm really looking for T3M4 here. I want to see if T3M4 has the Zetas. If he does, that means my opponent has a nuke team, meaning Darth Revan is not the best team to be putting on defense. I'm also looking at the rest of the Separatist droids, which in this case my opponent does not have built up. B1 doesn't even have the Zeta, so they're pretty useless. I'm looking at the Empire squad. I'm just looking at Palp, Thrawn, Vader, usually Grand Moff Tarkin, Death Trooper, because those will be the most often used in like an Old Republic counter. These Ewoks aren't usable, so that's like a 3 or a 2 for me. It doesn't have the Chirpa Zeta. It's nothing that I'm going to see. This is something that I love to see. Too much gear on a bad squad. So this means that there is too much GP allocation going towards one part of my opponent's roster, meaning that there's another part of my opponent's roster that is under geared. In this case, it looks like it's the Separatist droids. Just looking at the Padme team in the Galactic Republic, that looks like he doesn't have C-3PO, which was pretty clear from his Ewok team. That's a little surprising to see. So with the Geonosians here, this is great, but this is over-relicked at the expense of the rest of his roster where he's missing other relics. So this is a huge GP boost to bring against my roster with very little benefit for him on the other side. I'm not going to use my Trey against this, but it means that I'll just end up using my Darth Revan or a stronger team against it, but he's weakening the rest of his roster by doing that. It's probably because of his fleets, though he does have a strong Malevolence fleet. This, like the First Order and the Geos, this is just a bunch of GP in a place that it shouldn't be. Looking at the Jedi Knight Revan team. Night Sisters, I want to see if Daka has a Zeta. The other Zetas are there, so I'm probably going to see a Ventress lead, but nothing to really worry about. Mission doesn't have the Zeta in this low gear, so I can easily underdog that. I like to look at Phoenix and Rogue One just to see where the gear levels are at. If the gear levels are high enough, a lot of people feel like they're worth putting on defense even when they're not. Looking at this is right at that threshold where my opponent might think about putting their Phoenix team on defense. Rebels, these relics are in the right places. Probably going to use them on offense, but something to keep in mind. Resistance here is fine. Rogue One, again, this is just to see if there's wasted gear on a squad. This has been mostly looked at elsewhere, but really I'm looking at Newt and Dooku here. They don't have the Zetas. They're usable, but not any threat. Also, I'm looking for Watt. In this case, he doesn't have a Watt. So Sith, we're looking at the Triumvirate. This will work against my Geos. They're fine. Here with Sith Empire, really Malak is what I really want to know about. But I'm also looking at the gear in general. This isn't a Darth Revan team I'm going to have to worry about. Smugglers, I'm looking at Nest and Vandor specifically. and then secondly, a little bit at the rest of the gear levels. But I want to see if Vandor has the Zeta and where the gear levels are at. So my opponent will probably end up using a Smuggler team. Even at low gear, it's worth using. I, at gear 8 and 9, use my Smuggler team. It's better than using a gear 11 Phoenix team. So then I take that information and I make, one second here, I make a list of what the top teams are, and I'm looking at, okay, which teams are the worst case scenario, which I was alluding to earlier, but then I start planning out my offensive and defensive strategy around what the worst case scenario could be before I start looking at some other information. So next up is I want to look at, second here, I go into Discord, look at the DSR bot, and if your guild doesn't have the DSR bot or you don't have it on Discord, you can go to you can join my Discord and use it there. But this is a really good quick shorthand for knowing how you match up against your opponent's roster. It's just a quick way to get at that information. So I'm looking at the GP levels. Here we can see that I have a lot of extra GP, so I have a much deeper roster in my character GP. Then I'm looking at the overall relics, and then I'm looking at the lifetime championship score, where I have an advantage, but he's still doing well. And like I looked at earlier, the underdog wins. Next up, I want to see, that's going to keep happening for some reason, but we're just going to deal with it. We're looking at the Zetas. I want to see the Zeta count. I want to see the gear 11 to see where the GP is coming from in my opponent's roster. Like for me, I have a lot of gear 11 where he has a lot of GP in his gear 12, but he also had a lot of wasted gear 12. So he has more of a top heavy roster than I do. Then I'm looking at the mods here. This is kind of surprising to see. I'm very deliberate about the 6-dot mods, or the 5-dot mods that I take to 6-dot. I think it's a waste to just arbitrarily give them to your squad arena team or your other meta teams unless the mod itself deserves it. I feel like a lot of people are wasting those materials. Like for me, if it's plus 19 and up, I'll turn it into a 6-dot mod, or plus 19 speed and up, I'll turn it into a 6-dot mod. And below, that gives me flexibility for the rest of my roster and allows me to still have a lot of speed on other characters who may be gear 11 and below. So our speed plus 10 is close, the speed plus 15 is close, but I have double the plus 20. Plus 25 doesn't really matter, that's all about RNG. And then the offensive mods are nice to look at, that's fine. And then I take a look at just where the speed and gear compares on the rest of these meta characters, but since this is blacking out for whatever reason, I'm not going to edit this out later. We're just going to kind of skip through it, but I'm just looking at, okay, where does my Revan speed match up against his? Where does my Jedi Knight Revan speed match up against his? And so on. This needs to get updated, but still a good quick shorthand. Next up is I go into SWGOH.gg and I put in my opponent's information. So I take their ally code, you just put it into this URL like here, right after P is your ally code. Put that information here. Then I can look at the Grand Arena history. So with the Grand Arena history, I'm looking at a couple things. On offense, I want to see if my opponent is having any trouble. And here, this is kind of surprising. Against the Darth Revan, He's kind of using a nuke team, but his T3M4 is there. So it looks like he doesn't actually know how to use his nuke team, even though he has the Zetas. Then I am looking at the teams he's using on offense. If there's any other losses that he's having trouble with, it looks like it's just against the Darth Revan team. Then I'm looking at which fleet he's using on offense. He's using his stronger fleet. On defense, this is where I spend a little bit more time. Really, I'm just looking to establish my opponent's habits. So I write down all the teams I'm seeing on defense, and then I go through a few of these other rounds, and I do the same thing, looking at which teams he's using on offense and where the losses are coming, and then which teams are using on defense. In this case, like, one of the surprising things is he's using that Phoenix team, which is not good, and it's going to be free banners for me. That's not worth using. And it wasn't particularly geared high. It was a gear 10 team. So jumping back here. I start plotting out my strategy from there based on the Grand Arena history. Start looking at, okay, there's a worst case scenario, here's the likely scenario, and then looking at which teams that leaves me for defense so I can shift some teams over to defense that I might otherwise not. Like in this case, I can probably throw my Padme on defense and bump up the strength of my defensive strategy. Okay. So that's how I quickly break down this information. Like I said, I don't like to take more than like 15 minutes doing this. This is something that I want to be in and out pretty quickly, not spend too much time thinking about, but also be able to change up my defensive strategy where I can, because I don't want my opponents looking at my history and finding a predictable set defensive strategy each time. So this is going to be the first part of a multi-part series on Grand Arena. I've got 3 or 4 other videos I want to do on different strategies and tips. I take this game mode very seriously. It's my favorite part of the game. So like and subscribe if you want to see any of that information below. That'll be coming out over the coming weeks. I'm going to be interspersing that with a couple other video ideas that I have. Other than that, stay safe out there and be excellent to each other. Thank you for watching.